Now to join this discussion, we're joined by our guest, Mr. Yasir, who's a CEO, strategist and an economist. Sir, hello and welcome to Perspectiva. So why does Iran consider the Strait of Hormuz a historic opportunity at this point?
Well, thank you for having me, and I think it's a very important question because all eyes are on Strait of Hormuz right now. But I think that Iran does not look at the Strait of Hormuz as a shipping lane. It sees it as a leverage. And for decades, Tehran has lived with sanctions, pressure, and isolation, as we know of. And that actually shapes the strategic thinking of Iran. If you cannot compete economically and you cannot match your rivals militarily, you look for another source of influence. And for Iran, that source is actually geography. There is an old observation often associated with Napoleon that geography is destiny. And this is so true in case of Iran and in case of Strait of Hormuz. And whether one fully agrees with that phrase or not, Iran's leaders clearly understand the strategic value of geography. And there are few countries that possesses a strategic asset of this magnitude sitting literally on their coastline. In that sense, the opportunity, I think, is not about winning a conventional confrontation. It is about turning location into influence and using geography to generate bargaining power beyond Iran's economic weight. And of course, if we look at this conflict, especially now, the timing matters because the international system is more fragmented now. If you look at the United States remains the world's leading military power, but it is also now dealing with Europe, the Indo-Pacific, and the Middle East simultaneously. From Tehran's perspective, that creates an opening because major powers are now forced to divide their attention. And I think there is also a historical dimension to it that if Iran's strategic thinking has long been shaped by the belief that outside powers have repeatedly intervened in the region, while Iran itself has had to absorb the consequences. Whether one agrees with that interpretation or not, it influences how Tehran reads today's environment.
But sir,
And lastly, I would say, yes,
no,
please.
of course, carry on, it's okay.
Yeah, so the last point I would make is that when Tehran talks about Hormuz, I do not think that it is simply thinking about military victory. It is thinking about bargaining power. It is trying to remind both regional rivals and global powers that pressure on Iran can have consequences extending well beyond Iran itself. That is why Tehran increasingly sees Hormuz not simply as a waterway, but as a strategic opportunity.
Well, sir, if Iran does start charging ships that are transiting through, what impact could this have on global energy prices and also for international trade?
I think this is also a very important point and a question because right now, since there is some reconciliation is going on between United States of America and Iran, and Iran has categorically said that it wants some kind of concession or some kind of management or a kind of toll or a fee, which is quite vulnerable, especially for the countries in the Middle East and also beyond, because as we know that there are some Southeast Asian states, they heavily depend on the Gulf energy, especially on the Strait of Hormuz. I think the first impact would probably be psychological, not physical. Markets price risk very quickly. The moment traders believe freedom of navigation is under pressure, shipping costs, insurance costs, and energy prices start moving. Energy markets dislike uncertainty, even more than they dislike shortages. So you do not need a complete closure for markets to reset. And we have seen this repeatedly in the past. For example, during periods of heightened Gulf tensions, including tanker incidents and attacks on energy infrastructure, Prices often moved sharply even when physical supplies remained available. If transit fees were actually enforced, the effect would likely be threefold. First one is higher insurance premiums. Second is higher transport costs and more price volatility across oil and LNG markets. And what it would do, this in turn would feed into inflation because energy affects transportation, manufacturing, agriculture, logistics, and ultimately consumer prices. So the story is not just about oil, it becomes a broader economic issue very quickly. And as I mentioned earlier, like countries like China, India, Japan, South Korea, they are heavily dependent. So the broader point is that markets would interpret transit fees as a signal that one of the world's most important trade arteries had become less predictable. Even if physical energy supplies continued moving, the perception of risk alone would impose significant economic costs. That is why the first battle, I think, would not be over oil volumes, it would be over market confidence.
But sir, does international maritime law allow Iran to regulate or impose tolls, I should say, on ships passing through the strait?
I don't think so because most major maritime powers treat the strait as an international waterway where transit should remain protected, and this is what international law actually allows. Iran can certainly regulate safety and navigation within its territorial waters only, but unilateral tolls on international shipping would be highly controversial in my view. And that said, this issue is never only about law, it is also about legitimacy. The central question, which to me is whether Iran can advance a legal argument, and in fact, states make legal claims all the time. The more important question is whether other countries would recognize and accept that claim, because most major maritime powers would argue that unilateral transit fees are inconsistent with long established principles governing international navigation through strategic waterways. My view is that most major powers would not recognize such tolls as legitimate. They would likely regard them as a challenge to established maritime norms and seek to contest them through diplomatic channels and through could be international institutions or through some political pressure, which is why in practice the issue would be determined not only by legal interpretation, but also by the degree of international acceptance that interpretation receives. In international politics, legality and legitimacy do not always mean the same thing. In case like Hormuz, legitimacy may ultimately matter more.
Well, sir, could this dispute trigger yet another military confrontation in the region as well?
We are aware of the fact that there has been a sort of crisscross situation between Iran and United States. We have seen skirmishes every now and then during the negotiations. We are looking at the Israel, which is being considered as a major spoiler, is still there is a blitz going on in Lebanon and as well as in Gaza. So beyond any shadow of a doubt, the situation is fluid and can be fluid. But I think a limited confrontation is far more likely than a major war. And I have reasons. None of the principal actors, including Iran and United States of America, they want a large-scale conflict and they can't even afford it. Iran understands the risk. Imagine a country which has had received about more than 100,000 of attacks. Imagine a country in which more than 1 million people are displaced. Economy of Iran is in shatters or tatters. United States of America badly wanted an exit ramp. So actually all the sides know their have come to this point that they have strategic limitations, as well as the Gulf countries understand the risk. The economic costs alone would be enormous, but that does mean escalation risks are low. History shows that major crises do not always begin because leaders consciously decide to start a war. Quite often they emerge because events move faster than diplomacy. And Hormuz is particularly vulnerable to that kind of scenario. You have naval vessels, drones, surveillance aircraft, commercial shipping, and military assets from multiple countries operating in a relatively confined space. That is exactly what I feel is the kind of environment where accidents, miscalculations, and misunderstanding can occur. And the last point I would make is that is why I think the greatest danger is not a deliberate decision to start a war. The greater danger is an incident that begins locally and then gathers momentum before political leaders can contain it. The possibility of miscalculation should never be underestimated.
And what would be the short-term and the long-term consequences for energy importing countries if shipping through the Strait of Hormuz is disrupted?
I think the immediate concern would be physical disruption to energy flows. Energy importers could face delays, rerouted shipments, tighter inventories, and higher procurement costs. Markets would react quickly, but the deeper concern would be whether energy could continue moving reliably through one of the world's most important trade corridors. Countries most exposed would be major importers in Asia, particularly China, India, Japan, and South Korea, because of their dependence on Gulf energy supplies. But in my view, the longer term consequences are actually more significant than the immediate shocks. And why? I have the reasons to bring about this. History shows that every major energy crisis leaves behind a policy legacy. For example, oil shocks of the 1970s fundamentally changed how governments think about energy security. Countries diversified supplies, expanded strategic reserves, improved efficiency, and invested in alternative technologies. So a prolonged disruption in Hormuz could produce a similar response. Governments would likely accelerate investment in renewable energy, nuclear power, LNG diversification, battery storage, and alternative transportation corridors. In other words, repeated disruptions could gradually reduce the strategic leverage that critical choke points currently provide. This is a broader lesson here.
And so looking ahead, what is the most likely outcome? Is it diplomatic compromise, continued tensions, or renewed conflict over one of the world's most vital energy corridors?
Well, that's a very, very important question because it's all about predictions. And in such a precarious situation, predictions are actually quite difficult to make. If I had to assign rough probabilities, I would say continued tension and periodic crisis remain the most likely scenario. I would place that at a roughly 60 to 65%. A diplomatic accommodation or de-escalatory arrangement perhaps around 20 to 25%. A limited military confrontation around 10 to 15%, and a major regional below 10%. And the reason I lean in that direction is fairly simple. None of the major players appears willing to abandon its core strategic interests. Iran wants leverage and deterrence. The United States wants freedom of navigation and regional stability. The Gulf states want uninterrupted exports, and Asian economies want reliable and affordable energy supplies. Those interests often clash, but they do also create restraint. No major actor, no major actor in my view benefits from a prolonged disruption, which is why escalation and de-escalation frequently occur side by side. And that is why I would expect a familiar pattern pressure, military signaling, diplomatic engagement, temporary claim, and then renewed friction. In other words, a cycle rather than a resolution. But I think we should be careful not to view Hormuz only through the lens of crisis. The deeper story is that the strait has become a reflection of broader changes in the international system. We are witnessing three major trends simultaneously. First, the rise of Asia as the principal consumer of Gulf energy. Second, the gradual emergence of a more multipolar international order. And third, the growing use of economic interdependence as a source of geopolitical leverage. So, in that sense, Hormuz actually sits at the intersection of all three. That is why every incident there attracts global attention. It is not simply about ships or oil tanks. It is about how geography, economics, and power continue to shape one another in the 21st century. And if I had to summarize the issue in simple words, I would say that it would be this: Iran is not trying to defeat its adversaries, but it's trying to turn geography into leverage. And that Strait of Hormuz leverage becomes global.
So thank you. Appreciate your time today.